I Don't Mind Tellin Ya, an autobiography by Jim Caldwell. Introduction. After playing in many bands and doing countless gigs throughout Western Canada, I've got a long string of great memories, broken down vehicles, and frigid prairie blizzards to show for it. Every now and then our band would land an exciting, higher profile gig, like the time we opened some shows for Foghat. And then there's the flip side of a good experience, where the equipment truck gets totaled in a crash, and it happens while we're halfway through a month on the road during January in northern Alberta. This tale is told from a very narrow perspective. You know the saying, sex, drugs, and rock and roll? That's kind of like this story, except there's no sex or drugs, but there is rock and roll plus some talk of depression thrown in later just for good measure. For example, I've purposely not written about an experience where a friend obtained some genuine Owsley LSD from San Francisco. I was living in Victoria at the time, and it came to us through a friend of a friend of a friend. The story I heard was that the tablets were concealed inside a box of chocolates that had been sent through the mail from San Francisco. My friend Dave and I split one of the tabs and proceeded to have the psychedelic experience of our lives. We spent most of that incredible evening at beautiful Butchardt's Gardens just outside Victoria, being safely chaperoned by another friend. On that particular night at the Gardens, everything was in full bloom and then some. As George Harrison said to an interviewer, "You only need to take LSD once." He joked that he'd taken it many times, but explained that once was enough to understand it. John Lennon's Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds depicts a very accurate picture of what an LSD experience might be like. Another thing I won't be writing about is the band leader who, together with his wife, would attempt to initiate discreet encounters with singles and other couples. No thank you. Color me oblivious. One of the most dangerous things that happened that I definitely won't be writing about is the weekend band getaway camping party trip where someone brought a drug called MDA and some of the partygoers injected it. That was freaky. Acting normal in public after drinking a beer or smoking a joint is of course no big deal, but after injecting MDA, normal shifts to a whole new level. The party was going well in a campground near Long Beach on Vancouver Island, when out of the blue we spotted an RCMP cruiser coming our way. There was a huge freakout at our campsite, because besides the MDA and the people who had injected it, we had lots of pot and all kinds of paraphernalia. Plus, the guy who owned the van always had the best hash, and for this trip he had brought lots of it. Trying not to draw attention to ourselves, we quietly helped our very high friends get comfortable in the back of the camper van and somehow managed to stash everything else out of sight. Eventually, the police cruiser stopped near us, and the officers exited the vehicle. We were all completely freaking out on the inside while trying to appear normal and relaxed as we lounged around our campsite. The policeman eventually walked out to a different site and started talking to those folks. It turned out they were investigating a noise complaint which had come in earlier and none of it had anything to do with us. Biggest sigh of relief ever. We got out of that weekend safe and sound, thank goodness, and fortunately I never encountered needles again. So no, none of that stuff is in this story. All my life's been a long, slow knife. John Lennon, Out the Blue. Since the early 1960s, I have never been very far from a guitar. And in 2022, I celebrated my 70th birthday. Growing up in Victoria, my school friend Jimmy got an acoustic guitar for his birthday. He brought it to my house, it captivated me, and I was hooked on music for life, just like that. It turned out my mother was musical, and I hadn't known that about her until then. There had never been any musical instruments in our home before. She opened up the beginner guitar book that Jimmy brought and easily strummed through a song called Beautiful Brown Eyes. Of course, I received a guitar for my birthday that year too. It was awesome. A nasty acoustic thing with the strings a half-inch off the neck, but at the time it was the best and coolest guitar ever. To quote Canadian artist Tom Wilson describing his first guitar, it was black and dangerous, like a pack of wolves with 6 strings. I eventually spray painted mine blue and later smashed it to bits. Every last splinter of that guitar was fully enjoyed. And to my grade 4 teacher, Mrs. Rose, thank you so much. You played piano and taught us music theory. I remember Mrs. Rose teaching theory, and all those key signatures and sharps and flats just made perfect sense to my little grade 4 brain. It's almost like the information was being unlocked rather than taught. Around that time, my mother started violin lessons, and I was very surprised to learn that she already knew how to play the piano. My father bought a big electronic organ with a built-in beatbox, and even my older sister started taking guitar lessons. There was an elevated interest in music around the house, but we never played together. Eventually, my mom started playing with some of her musical friends, so I tagged along and learned songs of the day like King of the Road by Roger Miller and Green Green by the New Christie Minstrels. We joked about Mom's band, and it was a lot of fun. She taught me about relative minor chords and scales, and even figured out the intro to Purple Haze for me on her violin, telling me what notes to play. That was a great introduction to ear training. All of that experience soon evolved into electric guitars, amps, and playing in bands all around Victoria before me or any of my friends could drive. The first band I ever gigged with was called the Kidnappers. Up until then, I'd been meeting with other neighborhood kids and bashing out songs, but the Kidnappers actually had a drummer and we got a gig. We had no bass player, and I'm sure we only knew 5 songs, so we played them repeatedly and it was so exciting. I vividly recall 19th Nervous Breakdown by the Rolling Stones being one of those 5 songs. A few short years later, that drummer, John, was the top drummer in the top rock band in Victoria. His band was called Holy Smoke, and by then they had played with both Blue Oyster Cult and T-Rex. John then went on to continued success with Nick Gilder and Sweeney Todd and their big hit song Roxy Roller. Back in the day, though, we were all still in the 7th or 8th grade, and I was quite happy being a kidnapper. That was until my friend Dave offered me the lead guitar spot in his popular band, the Mystics. This was 1966. The Mystics were a big step up for me, so I took the new gig. My fellow kidnappers were initially quite upset when I told them I was leaving, but they got their satisfaction soon enough because the fellow who replaced me, Grant, was a way better player than me. Plus, Grant and John went on to be good friends and played together for years. The Mystics had gigs and were somewhat popular. Plus, we wore matching outfits and even tried a little choreography. Ouch. That part was never my thing. We copied our stage moves from Paul Revere and the Raiders, whose music we loved. When an opportunity for us to make a recording arose, courtesy of a local radio station, the song we chose to cover was Kicks, which was Paul Revere's big hit at the time. And the recording we made was called an acetate, where the band played the song live and the sound was fed into a cutting machine which created the disc in real time. There was only one copy, of course, so for the next few weeks we took turns sharing it and playing the record for our friends and families. It was a very cool experience at the time. Acetates are generally a low-grade product, and eventually their quality deteriorates after many plays. I have no idea what became of ours. The leader of that band, Bruce Obie, is now a highly respected, award-winning writer. The Mystics lasted through my junior high school years, and when they ended, Dave and I continued on together through a few more bands. Pot and acid had come onto the scene by now, and the world was changing, evidenced by the names Harvey Wallbanger and Crippled Dick, which were 2 of the bands we were in during our high school years. Dave was a very good bassist who also sang, so eventually he got a better offer from a more seasoned band. Our musical paths mostly diverged at that point, but I did get to hang with Dave a few years later when we were both gigging on the road in Alberta. At the time, though, after Dave left, I kept working with the drummer from Crippled Dick, who was named Vern, and he and I connected with a new bass player, Mark, and a great keyboard guy named Dan to form our new group, Mission Ridge. By now, all of us were done with high school and were out working, buying cars and trucks and big PA systems. Vern purchased, on credit, an enormous set of chrome Slingerland drums, huge double bass drums and everything chrome, all with his brand new credit card. Dan played a full-sized Hammond organ and used a Leslie speaker, with each unit taking at least all four of us to lift in and out of the truck. In addition, Mark used twin Ampeg bass cabinets, and for our front-of-the-house PA system, we carried 4 AA7 Voice of the Theater speaker cabinets, plus 2 giant horns. We had a big truck, and it was full. This was 1972, and we had everything going for us, or so we thought. Dave Ringland was our manager/agent, and he and his wife Susie were doing a lot of really good work for the Victoria music scene at the time. We had good quality gear and transportation, and at the moment at least were 4 guys who mostly got along well. 2 big things we were missing, as it turned out, were talent and maturity. Undaunted, the 4 of us all quit our day jobs to make a go of it with Mission Ridge. Surprise! It lasted a really short time. One of our first immature misadventures took place during a one-nighter in Tassis, which is a lovely community on northern Vancouver Island at the end of a long, narrow inlet. Stunning scenery. On the day we drove in, the weather was extremely miserable, and there were areas of the steep, muddy road where water was coming up through the floorboards of our truck. Sitting in the cab, we could hear the equipment in the back slamming around as the rain pelted down and the truck lurched over huge ruts in the road. We pulled over to have a look, and it was somewhat scary. Most of the fragile vacuum tubes belonging to the Hammond organ had been shaken from their sockets and were rolling around on the floor, but nothing was broken. A couple of us spent the rest of the trip riding in the cargo box, sitting atop the organ, preventing it from bouncing up and down on the rough mountain road. Our contract called for dinner and accommodations, so of course we took full advantage in the restaurant, and I'm sure we all had some of everything. I recall the band did a good job that night. There was a new energy as we were entering a more professional phase of our career, or so you'd think. The next morning was full of sunshine, and the miserable weather was nowhere to be seen, so we stopped by the same restaurant again and ordered tons of food, charging it to the same people who had agreed to pay for the previous night's dinner. The restaurant assumed we were telling the truth, so we had a big breakfast feed and hit the road. The traveling conditions on this new sunny day made for a completely different drive home, and our return trip, while still taking about 8 hours, was nicely uneventful. Uneventful, that is, until we stopped by our manager's office and he was livid. We had been way out of line in not paying for that huge breakfast earlier in the day, and of course the client was burning up the long-distance phone line explaining all this to our manager right when we walked in. While we probably thought it was funny, our manager was trying to run a business. We didn't quite get that at the time, Dave. Sorry. The cash was coughed up and a restitution check mailed. Eventually, we were working 6 nights a week, and during one of these runs into Nanaimo, a bunch of shit hit the fan. It turned out that our drummer was the type of guy who liked to take chances. Like the time he used our equipment truck to steal bar furniture from a hotel we were working at in Duncan. And yes, they noticed, but that's a whole other story. On this particular night, after the club had closed, we were riding around in our friend's beautiful 1962 Cadillac, following the drummer who was driving his BSA motorcycle, complete with a girl from the club on the back. The search was on for a house party that had been talked about earlier. During the drive, someone in our car remarked that the brake light on the motorcycle wasn't working, and that's all that was said about that. A few minutes later, someone else in our car suddenly let out a loud shriek as they realized that the motorcycle in front of us was no longer moving. As our driver slammed on his brakes and cranked the steering wheel to the right, the back end of the enormous Cadillac spun around and hit the motorcycle like a bat hits a ball, except way louder. Driver, passenger, and bike were sent flying in 3 different directions, and the noise woke up everyone on the street. Porch lights came on and dogs barked. I'm not sure how the police didn't get involved, but there were no serious injuries, and after some quick rebending of the motorcycle fender, we all got out of there as fast as possible. The big hole that had now been punched in the side of the car didn't affect its drivability, but the owner was pissed. And of course, the bike owner felt that he was the one owed compensation. Around this time, and unbeknownst to me, Our devil-may-care drummer had also started bringing his own bottle of whiskey to the club we were working in, and that is a huge taboo. This guy would go on to have something of a drinking problem, but these were early days. He stashed a bottle of whiskey up on the drum riser, and sure enough, a server at the club spotted him topping up his own glass between songs. We were only partway through a 2-week run at the club, but after our set that night, the owner showed us the door and we were asked to vacate the premises. After the loadout, whoever was driving our truck ended up backing into the club's big neon sign and left some damage behind, but I think we got away with that one. My first fully professional band had suddenly broken up, and I couldn't move to Vancouver fast enough. Through the good graces of my older sister and her family, I was able to live with them in Richmond for a few months. My plan was to explore musical opportunities, and that's where I eventually connected with a family of musicians from the United States who were living in Canada, avoiding the Vietnam draft. Their group was called Shagnasty, and they had originally emigrated from Southern California to Alberta during the winter. After some time in the prairies, they lost a couple of original members and ended up relocating to Vancouver, picking up 2 replacement musicians. For some reason, the new guys weren't working out, so Shagnasty put an ad in the Georgia Straight newspaper, and that's where I first met them. Shagnasty was Cassie, Danny, their best friend Clint, and 2 young children. There were also several dogs, whippets specifically, which Clint raised. Add to that a steady stream of cats and kittens, plus a crow named Peyote who lived in a large indoor cage. Peyote could say handy things like, "fuck you," and the always favorite, "fuck you too." My parents actually met the crow once. Danny sang and played drums and did both of those things really well. He was also a main songwriter for the band. Clint also wrote, sang, and played bass. Together, their instrumental playing and harmonizing was worlds away from anything I'd experienced to that point. These guys were the real deal. They already had a Vancouver booking agent, so we got busy working as a trio. This trio format was a new experience for me, and as it turns out, a really good one. This was the 1970s, and we often played up at Whistler. I'm not sure what was up there back then. It feels like I was only ever there at night, and it might have been a log cabin that we played in. Sometimes on the drive up, Clint would let the dogs out of the van to run alongside the old VW as it struggled up the mountain. So in case you've been wondering, it was Clint who let the dogs out. We gigged around the mainland and Vancouver Island for a while. Then a decision was made for the band to return to Alberta and set up camp in Lethbridge. While previously living in Alberta, they had met Ron Sakamoto of Gold and Gold Productions and thought this connection would be a good one to follow up on. I was looking for an adventure when I met these folks, so moving to Alberta was fine with me. Cassie went out ahead of time and found a house to rent in the rural community of Diamond City, which is just north of Lethbridge. A few days later, on a late spring afternoon, our caravan pulled out of Vancouver. It consisted of Clint and Danny driving a large U-Haul truck full of their family's household possessions and all their band gear, and towing their VW van which housed all the animals. This was followed by me and my little 4-cylinder Vauxhall Viva with the back seat removed and everything I owned stuffed in there. It was just a few hours after this that I saw the northern lights for the first time in my life. We were driving north towards Kamloops in the middle of the night, and the sky was alive with the gigantic green shimmers. Ultimately, it would take us over 24 hours to reach our destination. No vehicle troubles, but lots of stops for animals. We arrived in Diamond City in the middle of the next night, stumbled into sleeping bags, and passed out. When I stepped out into the prairie sunlight several hours later, I saw that I had gone back in time. We'd left Vancouver in June of 1973 and arrived in Diamond City in June of 1873. To the best of my recollection, there was a Model T-style car puttering down a dirt road towards an old general store, which had an American flag hanging out front. As I was quietly freaking out, someone came and informed us that there was actually a movie being shot in the town, so we needed to lay low. My parents had planned a driving holiday around this time, which meant they'd be stopping in to see how I was doing. I hadn't lived with them for years, but this was the first time I was living in a different province and far away from any immediate family. Cell phones hadn't yet been invented, and I doubt we even had a landline then anyway. So of course they showed up in Diamond City right when I wasn't there. Their timing couldn't have been better, though. I was out running errands at the time, and it was pouring with rain, which meant the little house I was temporarily sharing was now centered in a sea of mud. Joyce and Bob, my parents, parked on the muddy street and began slipping and sliding their way to the front door, mud up to their ankles. Immediately inside the door was Peyote's cage, so they would have also been greeted with a loud "fuck you" upon entering. They left their decimated shoes in the entranceway and were invited in as my bandmates discreetly put the pot and the pipes away. It was a cordial experience, I was told, but eventually my parents tired of waiting and left their contact info with my friends. As they prepared to leave, Cassie saw that Peyote had been able to reach through the cage and quietly steal the laces from my father's shoes. Back outside, Bob attempted to use the shoes without laces, but the mud immediately sucked them from his feet. I was only told about this after the fact, but it must have been hilarious to witness. Sorry, Dad. My parents were extremely conservative, so meeting these long-haired anti-war Americans, plus the Crow, must have blown their minds. Not long after this, I found my own place in Lethbridge, and the band settled into a good routine of gigging, writing, and rehearsing. And thanks to the good folks of the Diamond City community, we were able to use their town hall as our rehearsal space. As planned, we were working steadily with Ron Sakamoto, and he was sending us far and wide. I had dinner with Miles Goodwin and the rest of April Wine at their gig in Fernie, and we opened a series of dates for Foghat, complete with Jubilee Auditorium shows in both Calgary and Edmonton. Most of our gigs were much smaller than that, though. We played most of the community halls as far east as Kamsack, Saskatchewan, and as far north as Grimshaw, Alberta. Back in Lethbridge, we opened for the Goose Creek Symphony at the local arena and hung out with Nazareth at their sound check, helping to finish on Dan McCafferty's Scotch. The Foghat shows led to more high-profile work, so a decision was made to recruit a second guitarist. Clint had a friend back in California who they felt would be a perfect fit, so calls were made and Howard drove up from Southern California to join the band. At the time, January, we were out on the road for a month, with our first 2 weeks being at a bar in Grand Prairie. Howard soon arrived in his cool little California boogie van, which immediately froze solid as soon as he shut it off, in Grand Prairie, in January. Well, guess what? Howard was not a good fit. He and I never hit it off. As the band continued working as a four-piece, I was losing my enthusiasm. We also seemed to have more than our share of accidents and vehicle breakdowns to contend with. Adventures suck while you're having them. Neil Peart. On Shagnasty's last night in Grand Prairie, our equipment truck was totaled in a crash with a local taxicab. Not our fault, but a huge problem for us just the same. New member Howard came to the rescue. He had found a friendly garage owner who used blowtorches to thaw out the frozen boogie van, so we eventually piled ourselves and as much of the gear as possible into it and headed to Red Deer for our next run of gigs. On a good day, that's a 6-hour drive, but this was not a good day. After unloading in Red Deer, two of the guys immediately climbed back into the van and made the return drive to Grand Prairie to collect the rest of the gear. Our best-case scenario 6-hour drive was in reality about 24 hours, driving the same stretch of highway 3 times in order to get all the gear and people from Grand Prairie to Red Deer. Musically, it turned out to be a good run in Red Deer. 2 weeks in the same place, and the hotel had a good vibe about it for us anyway. Danny sometimes wrote controversial songs like the one he called Mean Motherfucker, and he often sang an old blues standard called Backdoor Man. Let's just say that the clientele at this particular bar would not be offended by material like this. I was told that some of the waiters could sell you pot as easily as beer, carrying ounces under their shirts. Life in the fast lane, for us anyway. Eventually, the insurance claim for our Grand Prairie accident got settled, so we went shopping for a new truck, which for us meant buying something that was likely on its last legs, but had lots of room. We found such a beast on a used lot in Calgary. It was very yellow, It may have been an old milk or bread delivery truck. There was room enough so that even with all the gear, we were able to fit 2 big armchairs inside the rear doors. It made for quite a comfortable ride. Shortly after the arrival of the new truck, we secured an important one-night gig in Edmonton as a direct result of the Foghat shows. The previous night we were booked in Milk River, which is close to the U.S. border. So the decision was made to drive right through to Edmonton after loading out at Milk River around 2 a.m. The plan was to have an easy day in Edmonton with plenty of time for load-in and a good sound check. Well, our plan was proceeding apace when later that morning, about 8 a.m., my bandmate who was driving the truck fell asleep at the wheel. We were just north of Airdrie when our vehicle suddenly careened to the right and plowed down into a ditch, taking a giant highway lamp pole with it. Up until that moment, I had been dozing comfortably in one of the rear arm chairs, and then suddenly we got bounced wide awake and things were very fucked up. Amazingly, the truck still ran, but all the windshield glass was gone from the front end. My memory of details is pretty hazy, but we definitely ended up getting the truck back onto the highway and drove south back into Calgary to look for repairs. Driving on the highway without a windshield is absolutely nuts, but that's what we did. Why is it always winter in Alberta? Fortunately, we found a nice auto body shop that was willing to help out at a moment's notice. They went to work on it, but understandably, we'd brought them a big job right out of the blue, so even as they went to work fashioning clear plexiglass panels and riveting them into place, hours were ticking by. So much for our easy day in Edmonton. It was nighttime when we finally arrived at the venue, and the people who hired us were anxiously waiting for us at the loading dock. The gear was unpacked and set up in record time, and it looked like we might be able to salvage something after all. We had set up behind a huge curtain and could hear the buzz of anticipation from the auditorium. The amps were all on and working, and the mics were put at a best guess setting. It wouldn't be the first time we had to quickly dial in the sound during the first few songs. As the MC made introductions and the curtain began to rise, we suddenly saw that we were set up way too far back on the stage. In all the haste, no one had bothered to look on the other side of the curtain. In my memory, it seems like we were 100 feet from the front of the stage. It was bad. We played our first song and the sound was awful with us at the back of this big cavern. So much for only getting one chance to make a first impression. We stopped playing, put our instruments down, and physically moved all the amps and speakers to their proper places. What pros we were. Amps and speakers and lights had to be unplugged and deplugged and replugged, so it took some time. Plus all the drums had to be moved, and Danny usually nailed his kick drum to the floor, so there was that. Driving nails into a polished auditorium floor never went over well at the best of times. Ultimately, the gig ended up being okay, and we had no problem collecting the money that the agent told us was due. The next morning, we checked out of the hotel and continued north towards the next gig, only to have one of the guys suddenly realize he'd left all our cash from the previous night in his hotel room. We were about an hour away from the hotel by then, so back we went. When we asked the desk clerk, they knew nothing about it, and neither did the manager. When we asked the maids, though, sure enough, they had it. The lady said to us quietly that they didn't trust the manager, and that's why they had not turned it in. Who knows? The Shagnasty family had friends living in High Prairie, so on another trip when we were booked to play in Grimshaw, it was decided that the whole family would come along and visit their friends for a few days following the gig. This caravan consisted of our big yellow truck plus the family's VW van. I think there were 5 adults and 2 children traveling. About 90 minutes northwest of Edmonton is the small community of Sangudo, and that's where our big yellow truck finally bit the dust. The engine started knocking loudly, and that was that. There was a small garage in the town that was more than happy to replace the engine for us, so we left it with them and squeezed a minimum amount of band gear, plus all the kids and adults into the VW van, and continued on our way to Grimshaw. After that extremely stripped-down performance, we saw the best northern lights ever as we made our way towards High Prairie in the wee hours of the morning. Shagnasty's friends lived about 20 miles outside the town, and as we passed through, I saw a sign that read, "Greyhound bus, 7 o'clock. Perfect. I begged my friend to drive me back into town in a couple hours so I could catch that 7 o'clock Greyhound and make my way home to Lethbridge. He agreed, so after only a couple of hours' sleep, we were up again and he was taking me back to town to the bus stop. I made it in time and thanked my friend for the lift, and then started to get my bearings as he drove off. I think it was a Sunday morning, but whatever day it was, there was no one around. The hotel lobby was open but deserted, until eventually someone appeared and educated me regarding the bus schedule. Yes, sir, the bus was due at 7 p.m. That was one of the longest days of my life, followed by an even longer bus ride to Lethbridge, hitting all the high spots along the way like the Edmonton Greyhound Depot at 4 a.m. A week later, our newly repaired truck was sitting in Sangudo with a lot of our gear hopefully still in it, and our next gig coming up was a one-nighter at Sate in Calgary. We devised a plan that we thought gave us plenty of time and headed off in the VW to collect the truck and make our way back to Calgary with an easy schedule for load-in, set-up, and sound check. And the plan almost worked. Heading back to Calgary with our new engine, we got as far as Ponoka when the truck ground to a halt. A local shop took us in and spent a few hours figuring out that whoever had installed the new motor didn't know anything about wiring. It turned out that the truck had been running on battery power alone and finally quit altogether when the battery became completely drained. A technician worked his magic on it and got us back on the road, but hours had gone by and we were hopelessly late again. Money, that is, the lack of it, was always an issue. We once learned that a booking agent was collecting large deposits on our behalf and keeping those for himself. He would tell us how much we would be paid at the gig, and we would dutifully collect that money and give him his commission from what we thought was our full pay. There was no inkling that he'd already collected hundreds of dollars in deposits behind our backs. This went on for quite some time and only came to light when a client shared, unknowingly, a little too much info about the multiple payments he'd made to hire us. This agent was making way more than each of us on any given night. Around this time, U.S. President Carter offered amnesty to those American citizens who had fled the draft, so Danny opted to return to the States. I didn't want to go with them for a variety of reasons, so that part of my life came to an end and I stayed in Lethbridge, not ready to retire from the road yet, and not finished playing with Shagnasty either, as it would turn out. I quickly went to work getting my name and phone number out to all the bulletin boards and agents in the area. As I'm writing this in 2024, life prior to the internet seems unimaginable. Studio City was an agency in Calgary that Shagnasty had a relationship with. So when the band emigrated south, I kept in touch with our friend Gord, who was an agent there and had his finger on the pulse, so to speak. He arranged for me to audition for a band that was being built around a main singer-songwriter, and they had the backing of the agency, so it looked good on paper. When the day of the audition came, I was still living in Lethbridge and still driving the little Vauxhall Viva. So once again, I yanked out the back seat and this time stuffed a Marshall 412 cabinet in there, plus all the guitars, pedals, and cables that are the regular tools of the trade. Driving north out of Lethbridge on Highway 23, I was making good time and soon passing through the town of Workin, which was about halfway along my journey. As the town was receding in my rearview mirror, the mighty Vauxhall suddenly began to lose power and quietly coasted to a gentle stop on the shoulder of the highway. I tried to restart, and the engine turned over, but it would not fire. With the hood open and a minimal amount of mechanical knowledge, I noticed that the distributor had actually risen up out of the engine block a couple of inches. I reached in and wiggled the unit a little bit, and it easily dropped back into place, but when I tried the car again, it would not fire. Oh well, it was a nice day for a walk. There was a service station on the highway about a half-mile back, and when I got there, the folks were more than helpful. They towed the car back to their shop and got right to it, but sadly it didn't take long for them to see that it was not going to be a quick, simple fix. It was a Monday, mid-morning, when all this was unfolding, and I was able to make a payphone call to Calgary to let them know I was broken down with car trouble and would not be able to make it to the audition. Arrangements were made to leave the car for repairs, and I saw that this garage was also the local Greyhound station, And of course, the next bus was due in about 12 hours. A couple of things happened next. The town proper was across the highway from the garage where I was, so I ran across the road to make my way into town. Darn if I didn't stumble and sprain my ankle when I reached the other side. The shock of the sprain overtook me right away, and I became cold, sweaty, and nauseous all at once. I limped to a bench and rode out the shock waves, then began to assess the situation. My right ankle was incredibly sore and very swollen. I had my shoe undone and could put no weight on the foot, though eventually I did manage to hobble 2 more blocks to the local tavern. But hold on, this Monday was an election day. Bars were closed on election days. Damn! The good news was that the library was open, and I spent a very nice afternoon there, resting my ridiculously painful ankle and reading. Eventually they closed, though, and I still had about 8 hours before my next rendezvous with Mr. Greyhound. There was a motel on the highway across from the garage, so I hobbled my way over there, rented a room, and told them I was leaving on the bus later that night. Everything played out fine from there. I got back to Lethbridge in the middle of the night, and then a few days later did the return bus trip to Vulcan to bail out my newly repaired car. For those mechanically inclined readers, it turned out that after the broken distributor rose up out of its housing, it fell back in 180 degrees from where it should have been. It took the technician a while to figure that one out. Hats off to those guys. The little Vauxhall was pretty much done, though. Not long after the Vulcan trip, the car caught fire in a Lethbridge parking lot as a result of a fuel leak, and right after that, it magically turned into a Honda Civic. As for the audition, before a second one could be arranged, I ended up accepting a different offer from a working band that needed an experienced guitarist right away. It came in the form of a late-night phone call from Calgary through a different agent I knew there. They were a road band who were just finishing up a gig and losing a member. Their next job, 2 weeks at a hotel in Fort St. John, was scheduled to start Monday. I was hired over the phone, and in the middle of the night a car was sent to Lethbridge to pick me up. My new boss, Jack, was the band leader and a really good guy. He came with a big voice and an even bigger personality. It was his girlfriend, plus the bass player's girlfriend, who had come to collect me. "Oh no, not a long hair," is what Jack said when he first saw me. This was in the dark, in the middle of the night, in the middle of a crowded Calgary hotel room. We all said some hellos and then some good nights and tried to sleep because it would soon be sunup and time for all of us to drive to Fort St. John. Jack was also known as AJ, and he liked to be called Old Man as well. It came to pass that we all got to know each other easily on the long drive, and it looked like a good gig coming up. When I'd left my apartment in the middle of the previous night, I had $5 in my pocket. It was 1974, and even then $5 wouldn't last long. I knew at some point I'd be asking for a loan until payday. When we arrived later that night in Fort St. John, AJ headed to the address on the contract, only to find a vacant lot with a lonely sign on it about a future hotel. After a certain amount of freaking out, we drove back to Dawson Creek and got rooms for the night. This is where I had to deal with the fact that I was broke and would need some kind of advance to cover my share. That turned out to be no problem at all, which gave me a big sigh of relief. AJ was on the phone Monday morning to the Calgary agent, who told us to stay put and she would find us something. We ended up staying in Dawson Creek for a few days, and Jack made a deal with the bar owner which allowed us to literally sing for our supper a few times. Eventually, the Calgary agent secured a booking for us elsewhere, and that was the beginning of a long and steady relationship with AJ. Together with his friend Gary on drums, we played all over Alberta and western Saskatchewan, staying 1 or 2 weeks in each town. I had come to AJ's band through the world of rock music, so now I was exposed to real country music for the first time in my life. Roy Nichols, the guitarist from Merle Haggard's band, was a big influence on me at the time. I'd heard a lot of country music covers from the Grateful Dead when Bob Weir went through a phase, but now I was at the source. It was very cool learning all this new music. As good a singer as AJ was, he'd never written a song before, so I encouraged him to give it a try, and it turned out he was pretty good at it. We eventually recorded an album of his original music during one of our stays in Lethbridge. AJ had recorded an album of popular covers before I met him, which was done in Calgary, and then he sold them off the stage during his gigs, eventually selling them all. I knew the people who owned the recording studio in Lethbridge, where I'd recorded with Shagnasty, so we booked some studio time there and began the sessions for AJ's second album. It was bad. Nothing went well. Of course, we were as green as you could get with no studio experience to speak of, but unfortunately the studio staff at the time were also very inexperienced. The record got finished, but I doubt many were sold, and I'm sure AJ incurred some debt on that venture. Regarding Jack's songwriting, though, the title track of his album, called What Do We Listen For?, won him a songwriting contest and a trip to Nashville in 1975. His home base was Drumheller at the time, and the community there was very supportive of him. I recall heading out of town more than once, listening to Jack's music on the car radio, courtesy of the local station. Eventually Gary, AJ's longtime drummer, wanted to call it quits. For his replacement, I had a friend back in Victoria named Terry who was available. Terry and his wife headed to Lethbridge, which is where I had an apartment with my girlfriend. They moved in with us temporarily, then Terry and I split to get to work, traveling with AJ. We left the girls to fight it out for themselves. Terry's drumming was way more solid than we were used to, so it was like a big breath of fresh air for us. AJ's strength was always in his big voice and stage persona, not his guitar playing, and Terry and I became experts at following Jack as he would so often unknowingly turn the beat around. We had several regular towns on our circuit, and we made some nice friends along the way. On a personal level, however, AJ and Terry weren't getting along, so after some months of this, it was mutually decided to wind the band down. AJ was talking about moving back to Ontario, and I was on the verge of marriage. So that's what happened. I came home and unpacked my suitcase for the last time, got married for all the wrong reasons, and jumped back into the 9-to-5 world of an automotive parts department, which is the career I'd left behind in Victoria. The local Ford dealer in Lethbridge was happy to have me, and Gary, the manager, immediately nicknamed me Picker, because everyone on his staff had to have a nickname. Picker was actually pretty good, because of course it refers to picking parts orders, but I also picked the guitar, and Gary was a big fan of Chet Atkins. Thanks, Gary. It was a very nice place to work, and Gary was a great guy. His nephew, Rawn Wolfe, was just finishing high school at the time and came to work at the parts department too. Rawn played the drums, and we hit it off immediately. And because I was new in town, one of the first things Gary had me do was to go to one of his suppliers and purchase a battery. It was an odd request, but he did this because he was sure this particular supplier was ripping him off by lying about discounts, but he had no proof. So I went in, completely unknown to these people, and made a cash purchase in the fictitious name of Caldwell Farms. Sure enough, they sold me the battery for less than they were charging my new employer. Gary had his proof, and my bonus was a nice new down jacket with a FOMO Co. logo on it. Perfect for a Lethbridge winter. A lot of my memories of being a full-time musician during those long prairie days mostly involved being broke. So when I went back to a full-time job, I made a conscious decision to not to need to make money from music anymore. Don't get me wrong, musicians always deserve to be paid, though for me music equals freedom. And during my traveling time over the last couple of years, I was very free, but I was also very broke. Eventually, I was more than happy to trade some of that freedom back for a steady paycheck. I no longer had to boil my old used guitar strings in baking soda to get one more gig out of them. Even while working at my new day job, I was still busy most weekends gigging all over southern Alberta and southern Saskatchewan with a cool country band led by a wonderful man named Ron Sillito, whose wife Claire was equally as wonderful. This was 1976. Ron had recorded an album in Calgary using studio musicians, then assembled a band back in Lethbridge to play the material live. He was a very popular entertainer, and his music was on the local radio charts in southern Alberta at the time. It was very cool to play in his band, and the bonus for me was that a new drummer joined at one point, and that person has been my friend for over 50 years now. Remember Rawn from the parts department? His name is now spelled R-A-W-N, and we recently had another really good visit with him and his talented partner Reenie, singing and catching up. They harmonize beautifully together. Though Rawn played drums professionally for a long time, he is also a fine singer and guitarist, and this is mostly what he does now. Drums are still in the picture at his house, though, as their little grandson appears to be the next drummer in the family. Now that I was married and a day job was my main source of income, it seemed obvious that a move to Calgary would be best for both of our careers. I had to leave Ron Sillito's band, of course, which was a drag, because I loved playing with Ron Wolfe. On the positive side, Gary called ahead for me and made some advance introductions to his business contacts in Calgary. I ended up finding work easily with a nice company that had room for advancement and landed a weekend band gig through a newspaper ad. The band was not very good, but we worked a lot and got paid well. Its name was Free and Easy, and the drummer, Doug, has now been a good friend since 1978. Can't ask for more than that. There was once an occasion where Doug couldn't make a gig, so it was arranged that I would call Ron in Lethbridge to come up and play the dance with us. We were a trio at the time, and I knew how much we were getting paid, so I told Ron his share would be 1/3 of the pay. Apparently the band leader had other ideas that he didn't share with me, and it turned out that he had seen this as an opportunity to just pay our fill-in drummer a flat fee, rather than give him a full share of the band's earnings for the night. I was taken aside and got my knuckles rapped for telling Ron how much his pay would be, without checking with the boss first. Ron was my friend. He was the guy who did all the traveling, plus he learned about 50 songs in a very short period of time. He should have been paid more than us, not less. The band leader was only in the group because he owned the van. Around this time, Ron Sillito came back to Calgary to record again at Sound West Studios and invited me to play on the sessions. That was really nice of him, as he already knew great players in Calgary that he had used in the studio previously, and I was still pretty green with my recording experience. I scheduled some vacation time away from work, and we recorded 4 songs in total, the main one being an energetic cover of the song Hello Mary Lou, which was to be his next single. There was a popular Calgary country band at the time called the Drylanders, and those were the guys who had done Ron's previous album with him. For these sessions, it was most of them plus me, and they were very welcoming. The producer on the sessions was Larry Kunkel, one of the Drylanders, and I swear the engineer's name was Hank Williams. At least that's how he was introduced. A while later, during a take, he stopped the band to point out a particular string on a particular guitar that was out of tune, and of course I was duly impressed by his amazing hearing, and it was probably my guitar that was out of tune, but I really don't remember. Today, there really is a legendary mastering engineer working in country music named Hank Williams. Did he work in Calgary in the 1970s? As I was settling into life in Calgary, Shagnasty returned to Canada, first living near Edmonton, later relocating to Calgary. Once in Calgary, they met more players and expanded the band. I was not the sole guitarist anymore, though I once did 6 nights a week with them for 2 weeks as a trio in Red Deer while working a 9-to-5 job in Calgary during the day. That was 2 long weeks, but it paid well, and besides, energy was unlimited back then, right? Somewhere around this time, my ill-conceived marriage was mercifully coming to an end. By now, Shagnasty was regularly writing and recording, and Cassie was now writing, recording, and performing with the band as well, which brought a very cool vibe to it. Somewhere along the line, they changed their name to Shagnatty and returned to the United States again. They'd had an opportunity to record with some very experienced people, so an album called Rejoicing was created. I found out about this in a cool way as I was sitting on my apartment balcony one day, and a song came on the radio from inside that I absent-mindedly hummed along to. Then suddenly I realized, I know this song. It was the new Shagnatty band performing their tune, Don't Turn Your Back on Love, which is something I'd played a different version of many times. Their new album was done and released and getting airplay in Calgary. How cool was that? Calgary had something called the CPBA, Calgary Party Band Association. True story. It was approximately 10 bands with a central phone number which someone monitored. A client could book one of the bands specifically, or just call for a good party band and get whoever was next in line. My next gig in Calgary was with a cover band called Schooner, which was part of the CPBA. We wore white tuxes, but at least we got paid well and had some pretty good fun. This was in the early 80s. Once at a summer festival in Kimberley, we played 2 nights for their big dance and even rode in their parade on the Saturday morning. It was at the parade where my earlier bad behavior caught up with me, because in an uncharacteristic moment, some of us had stayed up way too late the night before and had a little too much fun. When we squeezed into the back of an antique pickup truck at 8 a.m. the following morning to do our parade duty, we had guitars, amps and drums, plus an old gas generator that spewed exhaust everywhere. The smoky old generator was louder than the music and my head was pounding. Note to self. After a couple of years with Schooner, their drummer and I moved on together and joined another of the CPBA bands called The Establishment. This band did well with corporate events, large engagement announcement parties, weddings and the like, and the people in the band were all first-rate. Very accomplished musicians who could read and play swing charts all night long if necessary. I was the rock guy for the Bob Seger and Michael Jackson guitar solos. So much was learned working with people of this caliber. They all had very high musical chops, but more than that, they were all just really solid people. Talk about teaching by example. At least 2 of them were full-time educators. The CPBA kept us busy. We were earning enough to afford a roadie, so as a group, we bought a used U-Haul trailer where the gear lived all week, and most Friday afternoons, our trusted roadie would pick up the trailer and go to work for the weekend. A big scandal that happened in that band was when the singer and bass player had an affair. I was oblivious, of course, but somehow it came out, and the next thing you know, we were holding auditions. Filling the bass spot was a smooth transition, as our current drummer already knew someone who was available, better, and a perfect fit. Several people came to audition for the vocalist role, and eventually a wonderful replacement named Jill was found. It's this version of the band that had the longest run, matching outfits and all. The Establishment was very business-oriented and had mutually owned equipment that was valued on a depreciating schedule. When I eventually left the band and moved away, my replacement bought me out as per the schedule and took over the income stream. All very civilized. It had been about 10 years since I'd moved to Calgary and taken that entry-level position in the parts warehouse of a large car and truck dealership. This is where I eventually met Jerry Fisher, and soon after that, his sister Yvonne, who is now my wonderfully talented life partner. Her parents had relocated their family from Winnipeg to Peachland, and sometime after this, Jerry and later Yvonne moved to Calgary. For a while, they lived in a rental townhouse with some other friends, and if I'm not mistaken, a few memorable parties occurred at that address. Jerry and I were co-workers, and sure enough, Yvonne came to work at the dealership as well. My main responsibility was inventory control, and Yvonne was hired to do data entry, so right away we were working together. It turned out she also played the guitar and taught me to fingerpick Dust in the Wind by Kansas, and the rest is history. Technically, I was her supervisor when we first met, but it didn't take long for that situation to flip. Early on in our relationship, she and Jerry traveled out to Peachland to visit their folks over a long weekend, and my future father-in-law Vince ended up sending a package back to Calgary for me. It was a large collection of books, all discussing and dissecting world religions and philosophies. He and I had not met yet at this point, though Yvonne had told him I was recently reading a book about the Buddha. Vince immediately dug into his library and shared his collection, and when we finally met face-to-face, we hit it off right away. Born in Switzerland, he explored much of Europe and Africa before settling in Canada to raise a family. The man had incredibly eclectic taste in just about everything, and we both shared a love of Django Reinhardt's gypsy jazz music. Yvonne's mother, Alice, has the dubious distinction of being the first person in my life to actually hug me. I was about 30 years old at the time when she reached out and put her arms around me as we were all leaving some social event and saying goodbye to one another. In my stiff upper lip, emotionally closed-off British upbringing, this kind of thing was simply never done. I froze up and freaked out all at the same time. The members of my childhood family were very emotionally stunted. It was everyone for themselves when it came to feelings and needs, which of course meant that neither of these things were ever addressed in a healthy way. Food became the drug of choice in my childhood home, and my mother was, unwittingly, the dealer. Would anyone like another sugar sandwich? How about a pie? Yvonne's family was night and day different than this. There were 7 children, a jazz-loving, funeral director father who could just as easily have been a philosopher, and a salt-of-the-earth mother who spent much of her life making sure those around her were properly looked after. In the 1980s, Yvonne's brother Les died suddenly in a drowning accident, and the world stopped turning for the Fisher family. It was fucking horrible. Their sister Anna Maria was right there when it happened. Devastation doesn't even come close to describing the aftermath. Weeks go by, months pass, anniversaries come and go. It still sucks. Les was a very talented man who had been the original source of Yvonne's inspiration to play the guitar, and Alice and Vince were never the same again. Yvonne has a twin brother, Vince Jr., who has followed in the family business of directing funerals. He's another one with a lot of natural musical talent, but actually makes his living operating a funeral home. After many years living above the crematorium, we fondly nicknamed him Vinny the Torch, and his wife is known as Toe Tag Tammy. Jerry, the family's oldest son and the man who introduced Yvonne and I, died in the 1990s after a long illness. This too was fucking horrible. Weeks still go by, anniversaries still come and go, and Jerry's passing still sucks. My remaining siblings-in-law, Pat and Kathy, continue to reside in the Okanagan Valley along with most of their adult children. Long before any of this stuff happened, and even before Yvonne and I met, I was just the new guy at the dealership and busy clawing my way up the ladder towards junior management. Eventually, I landed on assistant parts manager, though soon after this, I made my escape before becoming a victim of the Peter principle. I could see almost immediately that this scene was not for me for a couple of reasons. As much as I enjoyed the technical side of my chosen career, I was definitely not the right person to be managing others or schmoozing clients for sales, and more than once I saw other managers have their personal lives suddenly upended because the company needed them for something at the last minute. That potential conflict was not going to sit well with my busy gig calendar, where I had contracts and commitments weeks and sometimes months in advance. It was the early days of computers, and not unusual for me to have to set an alarm clock for the middle of the night and drive over to the dealership to change out the enormous magnetic tape cartridges that held whatever data was being updated at the time. This was about as big an inconvenience as I was willing to put up with, so I made a conscious decision around that time to just remain a Monday to Friday worker bee, keeping my evenings and weekends free from music. As an assistant manager, I was paid a slightly higher salary than my co-workers, but it was nothing like the money I was making gigging. Terry, my drummer friend from AJ's band, was now living in Calgary too, and we reconnected with him for a while. He was working with a very talented couple, Carol and Jordie York, who were full-time entertainers on the Calgary music scene and usually worked as a duo with backing tracks. They brought Terry in on drums and worked for a while as a trio with Carol on bass and Jordie on guitar. Jordie had an amazing voice. He was an excellent singer who was well known and highly respected in Calgary, both as a musician and a producer. And he had done some high-profile international work as well, one of those shows being a large production of Jesus Christ Superstar. Jordie has a long list of credits and credentials to his name, and at one time, when you rode the elevator to the top of the Calgary Tower, you heard music produced by Jordie York. By 1986, Yvonne and I were done with Calgary winters, so we got ready to relocate to Kelowna in the beautiful Okanagan Valley. She had lived in Peachland previously, and now her parents were in Penticton, so it seemed like a good choice. As our time in Calgary was coming to an end, I had been learning about MIDI, Musical Instrument Digital Interface, from a friend and bandmate Warren, who taught music at the University of Calgary. At the time, MIDI was a very new option for musicians, and it came along at the perfect time for us. As a matter of fact, we named our next group Perfect Timing. MIDI allowed me to sequence several synthesizers and drum machines together and have them play whatever I programmed. Yvonne and I didn't know anyone when we got to Kelowna, and I was still flying high from my great experience with the establishment, so I put my new knowledge of MIDI instrumentation to work, combined with the business acumen I'd picked up from my friends in Calgary, and began programming a backing band. At the time, television advertisers were commonly using older hit songs to sell their products, so that's where a large part of our set list came from. We figured if these million-dollar advertising companies decided the public liked a certain song, who were we to argue? Love Potion Number 9 is a perfect example of an old hit song that ended up on our set list because it was featured in a popular television commercial at the time, and it never failed to fill the dance floor. Just as an aside, programming all these songs was a learning experience like no other, keeping in mind that this was all happening pre-General MIDI. I'd first chart out the song bar by bar, then program the drum part on my trusty old steam-powered RX-15 drum machine, and build the song up from there. Bass, keyboards, strings, and horns were added as necessary, utilizing MIDI synthesizers and sound modules to duplicate the sounds from the records. That, plus a little artistic license. It was an amazing lesson in song arranging, MIDI programming, and learning how all those big hit songs were structured from the inside out. That was surely an unanticipated bonus from the experience. Out of the blue, we got a call from Terry, who was still living in Calgary and was on his way to see us for a visit. Awesome. A day or so later, we heard from him again because he was now having vehicle problems and would not be able to make the trip after all. And that's the last time we spoke. I know Terry went on to good success in Calgary as a member of the band Alien Rebels, who were very high profile at the time. They were known as the band that other bands went to see. Even though we drifted apart from Terry, Jordie and Carol became lifelong friends, and we still managed to spend lots of quality time together, visiting back and forth even after Yvonne and I left Alberta in the 80s. As a matter of fact, during the Last Regatta in 1987, Carol and Jordie actually traveled out to Kelowna and performed for a couple of weeks at a long-gone downtown lounge, and they even rode on one of the floats during the Last Regatta parade. When the riots started that night, the four of us were inside a downtown restaurant called Jonathan Siegel's, which is where Kelly O'Brien's is today. The restaurant doors were locked, and fortunately nothing was thrown in our direction, but we had front row seats to the SWAT police doing their thing, which involved lots of tear gas and a wall of officers having no patience at all with the idiotic rioters. Hours later, when it was safe to leave Siegel's, we did the slow drive home in the middle of the night through what looked like a war zone, leaving our eyes stinging from leftover tear gas and lots of mist and haze hanging in the air. Deserted streets and deafening silence. The next time Jordie and Carol performed in Kelowna was under much happier circumstances because Yvonne and I were getting married, and what could be better than to have two dear friends provide live music for such an occasion? It was June in the Okanagan, and the whole wedding came together perfectly. Today we have the wonderful photos and memories of a particular place and time when so many people who were so special to us were all together at once. And all I've got is a photograph, and I realize you're not coming back no more. Ringo Starr. Jordie sadly passed away in 2020. Part of his obituary reads, "Now free from the torments of MS." He was an exceptional individual who mentored many and put countless smiles on faces. One of his more thankful music students used to pay him with Scotch whiskey. He accrued a fine collection, and I'm happy to report that Yvonne and I were present for at least a couple of memorable tasting sessions. Carol continues to perform with genuine passion, and besides being an accomplished singer, she is now also a very fine pianist, having made piano her primary instrument many years ago. As our Perfect Timing band was getting closer to becoming a reality, we ran newspaper ads for singers, which led to us meeting and hiring Greg and Janice, who sang all the lead vocal parts, while Yvonne and I played live guitars along with our pre-programmed backing band. It all sounded pretty good, if I do say so myself. In order to support my music habit, I did eventually apply for parts work at the local Ford store, and fortunately they gave me a job. I had considered switching careers at this point, and thought again about working in a music store, or perhaps becoming a photographer, as I had fallen into photography with gusto and was shooting miles of medium format film in no time. Once common sense kicked in, I headed back to where the money was and started a nice long tenure with Orchard Ford. At the time, there was no room for advancement with this company, and that suited me fine. If I'm not mistaken, there were only 4 of us on staff then, and 2 of the guys, who were both much older than me, had been born and raised in Kelowna. I heard so many great stories of life in the Okanagan during the 50s and 60s. My co-workers knew every orchardist in the valley, and sometimes those guys would drop by for a chat and trade tall tales. I heard about how they would elude the police during the Friday night hot rod races, and other crazy pranks involving live chickens being locked inside somebody's office. But this was the 1980s now, and Yvonne and I were living in modern Kelowna, and were quite busy putting together a long mailing list to promote our new band. We targeted all the major employers in the area, as well as golf courses, clubs, restaurants, and bars. The band picked up steam quickly and was playing at the Kelowna Yacht Club New Year's Eve party in no time. Actually, during our years together, we worked frequently for both the Kelowna and Vernon yacht clubs. They were both great hosts who threw really fun parties. Perfect Timing ran for 3 years, at which point I needed a change. Working with the programmed backing tracks was fun and rewarding and all of that, but it became very stale musically. I never saw that coming, actually. This became a perfect example of a journey where the actual traveling is the point rather than the destination. I'd learned so much about music as well as our local music business while getting this band up and running, but now we were just doing the same show over and over, and it eventually got quite stale. And again, that's on me, because though it would have been easy to keep programming new songs, that could be a time-consuming process, and ultimately I knew I wanted to get back to playing with real musicians anyway. One of our last Perfect Timing gigs was at a local pub for a New Year's Eve party. They reached out to us, and we were available, so the money discussion started. It just blew my mind that here I was talking to this multi-million-dollar business owner, and he was grinding me over $50. That part of being in a band really sucks. Want to get treated like a second-class citizen? Join a band. We got our full price that night, but that kind of negotiating leaves a sour taste. It was also common to have to chase people for money after the gig was over, too. A lot of post-gig conversations began with, "He's gone home," or "Come back Monday." My jadedness was starting to show, but I still wanted to keep playing. So I stopped taking gigs for Perfect Timing and began the search for real musicians to replace the programmed ones. As far as working with good people, I'd had a nice long run from my years in Calgary with the establishment through to the Perfect Timing band in Kelowna. Once I started advertising for musicians, though, I was reminded that not everyone in this game is honest and forthright. I even had an unpleasant experience at the end of Perfect Timing, where I'd made an arrangement with another local entertainer to send any work that came my way over to him, as I was on hiatus from gigging for a while. We agreed on a percentage referral fee and everything seemed fine. Unfortunately, it soon became apparent that not everyone calculates percentage the same way. To quote Hunter S. Thompson, "The music business is a cruel and shallow money trench, a long plastic hallway where thieves and pimps run free and good men die like dogs. There is also a negative side." My search for future bandmates yielded exactly nothing, unless you include the drummer who was so excited to be auditioning for something he played completely out of control. Remember Animal from the Muppets? Or the guitarist who assured me he was the best thing since sliced bread, then just never showed up. This all led to me taking a break from being in a band for a while after Perfect Timing had run its course. We were still busy with music though, just not operating a band that was trying to sell itself. I signed up for singing lessons and took just enough of them to learn that I was not meant to be a singer. No problem. Playing scales was more my thing anyway. We shut down the Perfect Timing business and sold the equipment van, while at the same time planning a move to a different area of the city because an opportunity had come up for us to build a new home. We found a house plan with a perfect upstairs music space and asked the builder to implement a couple of modifications we'd come up with that would make it easier to move gear in and out. The contractor was actually a friend of ours who I had met first as a customer through my daily parts job, and the entire project went surprisingly well, based on horror stories I've heard from others. And then our lives changed again in a wonderful way with the birth of our daughter Allie in 1997. Yvonne was playing guitar, and we rehearsed all through her pregnancy, so Allie was attending live music sessions from the very beginning. In the years that followed, she got really good at falling asleep to the sound of a loud rock band rehearsing upstairs, and of course today she has excellent taste in music. As our musical journey was also continuing, in 1997 I reconnected with Greg from Perfect Timing, and we put together a trio with a third member, Keith, who played piano, saxophone, and sang, though not all at the same time. We called it Bandana, and our set list was pure commercial country pop. Greg was from that world, so he knew all the best songs for us to be covering. With the sax player and his repertoire of older songs, we could entertain seniors as well, so we did a lot of that kind of work too. There was also a local redneck country bar called the OK Corral that hired us frequently, where we played in the corner of a small room that had some pool tables in it. That was one gig I truly hated. I would bring a big black music stand with me and put it up as high as it would go to block my face. I don't think I cared if they saw me, I just didn't want to see them. Other than that, the stand had no purpose. From my experience, depression is a very insidious condition that creeps in so slowly, by the time it shows its face, roots are firmly established. It seems obvious now that the music stand was a big symptom. During the time of Bandana, I treated Keith terribly. Today, I'm happy to say that I've actually seen him recently and have been able to apologize properly for my horrible behavior at the time. The family I grew up in was never close or supportive of each other. I was told in later years that my mother would often sit for long stretches of time in a still and darkened room. Depression was quietly whispered about. My father's claim to fame was that he was the one who got mentioned when someone needed to hurl a cutting insult. "You're just like your father," was the ultimate put-down around my house. Some years later, an older sibling reached a point in their life where they simply couldn't get out of bed anymore. Depression was weighing them down, and I recall making a mixtape to try and cheer things up. Completely naive I was in those days. This is the same family that told Yvonne they wouldn't be listening to her live national radio interview because they didn't listen to that station. They weren't taking some political stand. They just couldn't be bothered to change the dial. You see, one of Yvonne's songs had been chosen for inclusion on a new CBC recording compilation titled All for a Song, and Yvonne was going to be interviewed on the radio by Sheila Rogers. When the time for the live interview came, the song, called Set You Free, was played, and then Yvonne and Sheila had a great conversation about writing the lyrics and the song's initial inspiration. As an added bonus for Yvonne, when the compilation was released to the public, some of her lyrics ended up being quoted in the liner notes. Sometimes the words you cannot say will set you free. On the day of the interview, later in the afternoon, Yvonne received a phone call from a random person who had heard the interview that morning and was so moved by the song that they wanted to find Yvonne and let her know how deeply it had touched them. "Hello? Is this the lady who was on the radio this morning?" It was very cool of that stranger to reach out. Crickets from the family, though. Meanwhile, back at the OK Corral, my music stand idea wasn't working very well. Some drunken wannabe cowboy in camo spotted me and decided that I had once beaten him up in a bar fight. He accused me of this, and further claimed that it was both me and my brother who had done it together, and tonight he was going to get his revenge. And of course I have no brother. Just as things were heading off the rails, salvation arrived in the form of a friend of a friend. My musical wife Yvonne is also a hockey player, and she was at the club that night with some of the girls from the team. One of those girls had a 6-foot-something hockey-playing brother with her, and he immediately stepped in and put a stop to the nonsense. Saved by the bell I was. Greg and I eventually moved on from Bandana and created a new group called the Kelowna Graffiti Band, the KGB. We teamed up with a bass player and drummer to get to work, and of course that's when all the fun starts. The new bassist turned out to be extremely stubborn and quite lazy when it came to learning new material. He was the one who was never ready when new songs were being rehearsed. On one occasion, as he was asserting his stubbornness, he flatly refused to tune his bass guitar prior to a recording session because he claimed it never went out of tune. What an idiot. And this guy definitely did not have perfect pitch. Now the rest of us had to retune to match his bass guitar. The whole recording project ended up being a big waste of time. That is, it got finished, but there was a bad vibe all the way along. I heard some of it again a couple of years ago, and it was still crap. The first drummer in the KGB was Dave, who was a really good player, very solid, and had an overall style I played well with. Sadly, he and his family ended up moving away from Kelowna, so we recruited a replacement who was also a well-known player on the local scene. KGB had a designated rehearsal evening, and everyone knew to show up by 7 p.m. and let themselves into the studio. Unfortunately, our new drummer turned out to be the type who would just blow off a scheduled rehearsal without a word. No call, no heads up. More than once he failed to attend. For all we knew, he was dead in a ditch somewhere. So it came to pass that this group of merry men finally disbanded as New Year's Eve 1999 approached. December 31st is typically a big payday for musicians, and this once-in-a-lifetime turning of a century was bound to be bigger than ever. Remember all the hype around Y2K? It was again our petulant bass player who stepped up and vetoed any gig because he wanted the night off. What the fuck? My New Year's resolution that year was to quit that band, so that's what I did. At the same time as all this, Yvonne and I had a truly fun project rolling along, which was a musical labor of love called Udu Mango. We played our own versions of Grateful Dead songs, strictly for our own amusement, using electric guitars and hand drums. Besides Yvonne and I, it included our talented friend Jim on various percussion instruments, and for a short time, a lady named Larissa, who taught music locally, played hand drums with us. The word Udu in our name refers to a type of drum, and Jim has one of these in his extensive collection. The Udu drum's origins trace back to ancient Nigeria. I love the music of Jaco Pastorius, first hearing him with Joni Mitchell. That live band she put together in 1979 with Jaco and Pat Metheny, Michael Brecker and Don Elias, plus Lyle Mays on keys was just on another level. Discovering Jaco's back catalog from there was life-changing. I'm a lead and rhythm guitarist by trade, but because of Jaco, I'd owned a bass guitar for a while and eventually got it defretted by our luthier friend Gary, at which point I fell deeply into a bass rabbit hole for a while. Coinciding with the fretless bass guitar exploration, I had recently come into possession of an authentic 1960 Fender Bassman amplifier. A friend and I were swapping some gear and I ended up with the amp. Wow, these things are rare and valuable. This one was in rough shape though and needed major repairs, both cosmetic and electronic. There are techs who specialize in amps like this, and we found one on Vancouver Island. I shipped him the chassis and he worked his magic on it, and it was back in a few short weeks. While the amp was away, my task was to strip the original cabinet down to bare wood and recover it with the proper vintage tweed covering and grill cloth that is readily available online these days. It all turned out fabulously. Jim, the percussionist from Udu Mango, also had a project going with a blues singer who played open tuning slide and sang all kinds of cool interpretations of covers from Bob Dylan to Tom Waits. I joined in with my new fretless bass rig and it made for a cool combination. Their group was called Small Change, which is the name of a character in a Tom Waits story. We had a lot of fun for a couple of years, recording 2 CDs and playing regularly at a club called the Minstrel Café. The Minstrel would often host well-known entertainers, and their names would be up in lights on the big sign outside. If no one famous was booked, the sign would be dark, and that's when we'd be playing. Gotta love being a local musician. Jim put so much work into promoting Small Change, but ultimately it was a thankless task. While my fretless bass exploration was winding down, Udu Mango was still lurking in the background and eventually morphed into the 6-piece band GrooveYard. I had put the bass aside and was no longer playing with Small Change, and our little hand percussion group had now morphed into a big loud band with 2 drum kits, 2 guitars, plus bass guitar and lead vocals. Yvonne was making changes too and had switched from guitar to playing drums, which was very cool. We played original music, plus some Grateful Dead covers, and ultimately recorded a decent CD called Place in Time that's still online, earning us about 30 cents a year. In the early days of GrooveYard, I was the lead singer, and as I said before, anyone who knows me would immediately recognize this as a problem. So soon we were auditioning real vocalists. That was another test of patience for me dealing with the idiots. More than one contestant showed up completely unprepared. One guy was so bad that we stopped the session early to drive him home as his ride was unavailable, and we simply couldn't stand it anymore. Eventually, though, we met Kevin, a really nice guy, and began to work up the material together. Everything was great as we got going, but we soon discovered that our new friend had serious timing issues. He was never sure where to come in and lost the rhythm of the songs very easily. Suddenly, we dropped about half our material because of these timing issues. On the plus side, though, our new singer was very spontaneous with crafty lyrics of his own, and besides the CD we recorded, we had quite a bit of good raw material in the works when the band finally gasped its last breath. There was a lot of potential there. In this group, it was the bass player who would blow off scheduled rehearsals without a call. Our singer eventually moved away for family reasons, and the other guitarist in the group just called it quits and gave up music. He was the type who just wanted to be in a band. The last gasp came when the bass player blew off a scheduled recording session. No call, no show, the end. GrooveYard had a lot of musical ability and potential, but the band eventually fell apart at the personality level. Imagine that. Around this time, we were connecting with a really nice country singer named Deb Stone, and consequently, a new commercial country rock group called the Deb Stone Band was born, with Yvonne on drums. We had originally met Deb as a potential singer for GrooveYard. She was well known locally, plus Deb and her husband Rich are 2 of the finest people you could ever meet. This new group got all of our attention and energy for the next couple of years. Though while this was going on, I did jump into a side project with what I thought was an already working band. My whole reason for playing during this time of life was to be making money, so I figured I may as well be out working while Deb's band was still in the initial rehearsal stages. There was a local advertisement for an experienced guitarist to join an existing tribute band that was already working and was promising a prosperous future. One of the carrots they dangled was that at their most recent gig, each member had been paid $300. I showed up at the scheduled audition time with one other guitarist, and we each took our turns while the other waited outside. Ultimately, I was offered the gig. On stage, we had to dress in black, with black hats and sunglasses. They supplied the hats and shades, and at one sold-out show, the audience received complimentary hats and shades too, all part of the fun. This costume-wearing shtick was never my thing, but I came to terms with it by accepting it as part of the job I was supposedly getting paid for. The band had a horn section and a wonderful music director who caused me to up my musical game in a big way, which was a great experience. Outside of that, the rhythm section was kind of lifeless and uninspiring. The bass player was more of an entertainer than a musician, and it was all very sloppy. I was on stage with this band many times, but it always seemed to be a free audition for something. After selling out the beautiful Creekside Theatre in Lake Country, BC, we were told that because of high expenses promoting the show, the band would not be getting paid. I lasted 18 months before resigning. Over that entire time period, I had been paid a total of $100 for my services and had experienced an equipment failure which cost $600 to repair. Of course, the equipment failure was my responsibility, but like Bob Dylan said, you don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows. To add insult to injury, when I gave my notice, they asked for their hat back. Back in Deb's band, there were some initial growing pains as we went through different bass players, piano players, and backup singers, but over the better part of a year, a group of seemingly good people emerged, and it looked like we were on our way to commercial success. In the background, depression was lurking deep and dark, but all I knew was I was angry a lot of the time and had zero patience for anything. On several occasions during those first rehearsals and early days of gigging, I acted like a total jerk towards some of my bandmates. Oddly enough, when I first met Deb, she shared with me a story of a guitarist from one of her previous bands who had become very difficult to work with and would often clash with other members. Apparently, Deb is psychic. Darned if that didn't become my story in this band. There's a saying, a friend is someone who knows you well and likes you anyway. And that's my friend Deb, truly a special person. In the early days of the group, I had a pretty good row with our first piano player, Ed. He played a cheesy little keyboard that had a built-in beatbox, and more than once we'd finish a song only to hear Ed's drum machine banging out its tinny little sound in the background. He would have accidentally hit the switch while flopping around on the keyboard, and only when the band stopped was it audible. My lack of patience and quick anger all came to a head at a pre-show sound check one day when Ed could not properly play the ending of a song we had just rehearsed the night before. It's not that he couldn't play it, it's just that he was way too self-absorbed to play it the way it needed to be played. Although he stood on the stage as a member of a band, Ed only ever heard himself. I lost my temper, some words were said, and that was his last gig with us. As a matter of fact, a couple of days after this, he had to come back to our house to collect some of his gear, and while there, he officially excommunicated me from his life. That was hilarious. I'd known this guy on and off for many years, and up until then, he'd always been a single, self-made entrepreneur. In the early days of us reconnecting again and working together with Deb, he shared that one day he had heard a clear voice in his head tell him to join a church, so that's what he did. Later on, the voice came back and told him to get married, so he did that too. He found a nice single mom with 2 teenage boys to settle down with. During his short time with us, he once showed up at a rehearsal with 2 homemade drumsticks for Yvonne. They were like chopsticks, only longer, and he had made them because he didn't like how loud her drums were. Deb sings a beautiful version of Patsy Cline's Crazy, which we were learning during Ed's tenure. Whatever key Deb was singing it in, it was way too hard for Ed, who insisted in playing it in the key of G, which only has one sharp, F sharp, and therefore could be considered easier to play. He twisted himself into a pretzel trying to convince Deb that she sounded better in his key, when she clearly did not. After the conflict with Ed, Deb reached out to me right away and we had a great talk about kindness and generally being nice to others. Obviously, Ed was a problem, but my poor handling of the situation was a bigger problem. She reminded me that this wasn't her first rodeo and frankly I could use to smarten up, whatever that looked like. She did this all so nicely, totally leading by example. I wasn't too far from being diagnosed at this point, and Deb's kindness really stands out in my memory. Surprisingly, we found a replacement keyboard player rather quickly, and he could definitely play crazy in whatever key we needed. This new fellow was a much better musician than Ed, and it appeared that band-wise, onward and upward was again the phrase of the day. Of course, the new guy eventually turned into a shit show of his own, but for now it was early days and things were looking up for the band. Deb had friends at the local theater, which led to us playing some really nice shows there. And on the recommendation of another local entertainer, Deb was booked for New Year's Eve at one of the most popular clubs in the city. I recall that gig fondly. We did a great job that night, although it helps when you got a packed house and it's full of people who only want to dance and have fun. A year of successful gigging and rehearsing followed, and sure enough, we were booked again for New Year's Eve at the same club. That's when the music train finally left the tracks. Our new piano player, who had actually reached out to us many months earlier and asked to join the group, was now quitting. He gave some reasons that were obviously bullshit, and that was that. There are not a lot of replacement musicians in our small community, so that became the death knell for the Deb Stone Band. Calls were made and gigs were cancelled. A lot of hard work and money went down the drain. About 3 weeks before this, that same piano player had insisted we all spend the money necessary to use Wi-Fi-based in-ear monitors. Now that expense, plus everything else we'd worked for, was being thrown away. As it came to pass, our very last gig together was not my finest moment. The band played well, doing a short outdoor set that the audience really dug, but I was pissed. As the last notes were fading away, I was in this guy's face, and soon enough we were hurling insults back and forth, and that's where we left it. As soon as leaving our band, which he was too busy to be in, he immediately started selling himself as a solo piano performer. At our house, band equipment was being advertised for sale. I was done with gigging and had been officially diagnosed as depressed. The gear was being disposed of at discount prices, and I went to ground. We had also bought another house and moved during this time period, and that turned into a long stretch where I was too anxious to even go outside. Of course, I had to go to work, so my days mainly consisted of rushing out of the house, rushing around an insanely busy workplace all day, then crawling home at the end. My family deserves the biggest medals for hanging in there for me. Because of my introverted nature, by the time I came home each day, I was unable to communicate much at all, just completely drained and then some. Eventually, I just started walking, and that was hard. Even the shortest outing felt like the biggest problem, but it was a beginning. With my doctor's help, I was able to regain some perspective and not feel so overwhelmed all the time, while dragging myself around the block, in the dark, every day after work. To quote Paul McCartney and John Lennon, "It's getting better all the time. It couldn't get much worse." I did still play some guitar at home and had a simple recording set up in a bedroom closet. A typical session would be me with a guitar and headphones, multi-tracking an instrumental composition from start to finish in about 2 hours. I called these recordings Jimmy and the One Takes because I had to be back at work on Monday and this was the only time I had. No time to fix recording errors. Actually, I wasn't really playing much then and practicing even less. The years following Deb's band were a very low time for me. It's never a good sign when things that used to bring joy now feel meaningless. Leading up to retirement, my life was feeling like a sports match, and I was losing, heading into the last quarter. One very creative outlet did appear for a short while around this time, though. The bass player from Deb's band had a friend who was a very accomplished drummer and recording engineer, and I was invited to start jamming with them at a local studio. We did some high-level improvisations and eventually started a recording project of instrumental compositions under the name El Camino. In hindsight, I was about as low as I got during these times, and at one point I actually excused myself from the project for a period of time. Memory is hazy of those days, but eventually we got back on track and started recording again. After 4 of the compositions had been fully tracked, there was another break in the action over something going on in the drummer's life, and that's where it ended. I had no skin in that particular game, so it was no big deal to me. A few of the tunes were finished, and these days, looking back, I think they sound great. Besides, I was keeping very busy on my own. Depression is a full-time job. Back in the positive world, a nice scenario that was playing out around this time was that my wife's co-worker, Lisa, had friends retiring to Kelowna who were also musicians. She soon introduced us to Michelle and Craig, who are good and wonderful people, the best kind you could know, right along with Lisa and her family. Craig and Michelle perform as a duo called Vaguely Obsessed, and soon invited Yvonne and I to start performing with them as a quartet. They called this new ensemble Four Circle Square, and it came at a time of life where I was kind of picking myself off the floor, glimpsing retirement on the horizon, and feeling about as low as possible. Thank you for your support. Today, Craig is very involved with the local music scene and has created many, many opportunities for us and other fortunate musicians to play live. I was finally able to retire at the end of November in 2019. For the previous couple of years, we prepared for this by buying and selling some real estate, as well as finding and refurbishing the home we would retire in. Given my mental state at the time and the busy nature of my job, Yvonne took care of at least 100% of these details. Yet even upon retirement, I still had to quit the ground running. As our renovation wasn't quite finished, we had a large storage unit to deal with, plus there were vehicles to buy and sell. And trust me, the last thing a depressed person wants is more responsibility. Then COVID arrived. Being both depressed and naturally introverted, I was pretty good at keeping my head down. During that time, a friend asked me the question, "Do you even know there's a virus going around?" Yvonne was scheduled to retire in the spring of 2020. Due to COVID, however, her department had already started working from home. So it came to pass that on her last day, a few of her closest co-workers secretly arrived at our house, face masks and COVID protocols in place, and presented Yvonne with beautiful gifts and well wishes. A stunning Alex Fawn print hangs in our home today thanks to them. Fast forward to 2022, and Yvonne and I were both now in a very creative place. She sold her drums and took up bass guitar, and with her deep musical background advanced very quickly on the instrument. Jaco Pastorius would always stress the importance of the bass player knowing the melody of the song as well as the bass line, and Yvonne is definitely learning in that direction herself. My personal darkness was morphing from black to gray at least. Over the last couple of decades, I had adopted the personal mantra, "Stop the world, I want to get off," because somewhere along the line things got to a point where I was constantly overwhelmed by the seemingly normal demands of everyday life. Retiring was a bit like stopping the world and has been a big lifesaver, along with my wonderful and patient family who are always there for me. Identifying the depression has also allowed me to at least notice when things get a little darker, rather than just being subconsciously controlled by those horrible feelings. That said, I still often say to myself, "What was I thinking?" after reflecting on conversations I have even to this day. It's just a slow turning from the inside out. John Hyatt. I also like to say that in retirement, I have finally found my calling. It doesn't take much to keep me busy, and I love having the time to act on creative ideas, and better yet, to be relaxed enough in the first place to actually have a creative idea. John Cleese's short book on creativity is a highly recommended read. As the first few months of retirement rolled by, Yvonne was studying hard on the bass guitar and ended up writing some instrumental music that sparked both of us into a very creative phase. It was like a bottle was uncorked and what flowed out was music. On a sad note, her mother Alice passed away during this time. Yvonne wrote a beautiful piece of music called The Marigold Line in her memory. I began using Facebook around this time as a place to post my little guitar compositions and cover tunes, and sure enough, I was reconnected with my friends from Shagnasty, safe and sound in the USA. It's been awesome to be in touch with them again, and although it's very sad that Danny has passed away, I know that during his life he had a positive influence on a lot of people, plus he left behind a wonderful catalog of his recorded work. And besides all that, he is forever immortalized in our instrumental composition, The Man from El Cajon. Through Facebook, I also reconnected with the El Camino drummer I had previously recorded with. This fellow had left the area but was still playing, so I reached out to see if he would record some drums for something Yvonne and I were working on. He sounded happy to hear from us, and we had a few messenger conversations about the artistic direction of the music. Eventually, we sent him our files, and sure enough, the first excuse that came back was that he had been injured in a bike crash and would need more time. His next excuse was that he accidentally lost the files we sent. Finally, he just stopped communicating. Someone explained to me this is now called ghosting. Our group Sutherland Bay grew out of the COVID writing sessions. In an early version of the group, Yvonne and I reconnected with our percussionist friend Jim from the days of Udu Mango and Small Change, and began running through the material to see how it worked with hand drums. No question it sounded great, but I wanted to explore it with a full drum kit, so we went off to play with some other drummers too. We already knew one very good drummer named Ethan who played with several groups, including Vaguely Obsessed, and was happy to help out whenever he could. It was very exciting hearing and feeling the new energy his expert drumming added to the music. We also had an old acquaintance named Dick who played the drums, and Dick moved in literally right across the street from us, saying he was looking for a new musical challenge and would be excited to play with us. We've known him on and off for a long time, but we'd only ever seen him play cover music or at least very basic original country songs. As we reconnected, we spoke openly about how he'd need to learn some techniques he had never encountered before, like odd time signatures. He was all over it, or so he said. Dick's wife was an old friend of ours whose previous husband had passed away. There are none so blind as those who will not see. Why won't they take me as I am? Is what Dick complained to his wife. Out of the other side of Dick's mouth, he was telling us that he couldn't wait to learn all the new techniques and beats we were talking about. That was the arrangement we had made. Dick would put in the work to up his drumming game, and we'd all move forward together. We spent a few weeks rehearsing 2 sets of material with him, taking note of the things he'd need to work on, and actually played those 2 sets in front of an audience at a live gig. During the performance, he made mistakes, exiting fills, and mostly rushed the groove, but I was still willing to work with him because I wanted to see him succeed at his stated goal, and of course for the group's benefit too. In the meantime, because we already knew the very talented Ethan, who was more than happy to sit in, we told Dick that we were going to invite Ethan for our next gig and give Dick more time to study and learn. This did not sit well with Dick, and he instantly excommunicated Yvonne and I from his life, which is a shame, mostly because now we've lost our original friend, Dick's wife. The last time Dick and I were practicing together, we were working on a 4-bar phrase of music which required him to rest for 2 bars, then fill for 2 bars. He just couldn't do it. It was only after I left that night that it dawned on me that he had no idea what a bar of music was. He'd only ever learned pop songs by mimicking what he heard on the radio, so he had no concept of bars or musical structure, and too proud or embarrassed to ask for help, apparently. He was keeping his illiteracy a secret. I wish I'd recognized this sooner, as it's possible the whole thing could have turned out so much better. He talked the talk, but that's where it ended. Once, during an early rehearsal, he pulled off a fill that he thought was rather flashy and smugly reminded us he'd never had a lesson in his life. I'm afraid this didn't come across the way he intended. Yes, Dick, we can tell you've never had a lesson. No matter whose name is on the marquee, the drummer is the most important person on the bandstand, Pat Metheny. Regarding Sutherland Bay, for the last year or so, Yvonne and I have been rehearsing, writing, and recording with our new friend Perry, who is another very accomplished drummer. Also, Ethan has a recording facility at his home called A Nice Basement Studio, and recently we had a lot of fun recording several tracks with him as well. There's not a lot of call for a group like ours to play live, that is, original instrumental music played on electric guitars and drums, but fortunately that's not an issue for me. Rehearsing and recording are two of my most favorite pastimes. Yvonne, I know, would like to perform publicly more often. No matter how well rehearsed a band is, live gigs always create unique challenges, and that sometimes causes just a little bit more stress than I want in my life these days. Speaking of stress, several years ago, some kind-hearted folks in Kelowna decided to promote a Woodstock anniversary concert held on a large acreage just outside of town, and they spared no expense making sure the sound equipment and technicians were top-notch. For the actual music, the promoters approached several local bands and asked them to cover some of the original groups from 1969. So one band covered the Who's set, another did the Jefferson Airplane, etc. Lots of the original Woodstock groups were well represented by talented local artists. For us, learning all that Grateful Dead music over the years finally paid off, as Udu Mango was also booked to perform. In the history of Woodstock, the Grateful Dead actually did perform, but famously refused to allow their set to be filmed, as they were sure that this would somehow lead to them being ripped off by corporate greed. As it turned out, the Dead's Woodstock performance was reported to be abysmal anyway. "We never show up for the big ones," is what Jerry Garcia is reported to have said later. The Kelowna venue was nicely organized, with huge separated fields for RVs and tents. There were vendors of all types and generally a pretty nice vibe. The only thing that wasn't there were concert-goers. This thing was very poorly attended and the promoters lost their shirts. To help out, most of the bands forfeited their pay, though the promoter did cover some traveling costs for one of our members who incurred some expense to show up. That was very kind of them considering they were bleeding cash. The weather had been hot and sunny during the weeks leading up to the big show, and the promoters had lots of radio sponsorship, so it was no secret this festival was happening. On the afternoon of opening day, though, clouds rolled in and things weren't looking good. Advance ticket sales for campers had been very slow, so I presume the promoters were counting on people buying daily passes at the gate. That didn't happen either. In kind of a sad way, in the days following the festival, it also became very apparent that a local journalist who reviewed the festival hadn't even bothered to attend. But they did manage to write their story. Following the weekend, an article was printed and glowing reviews were doled out to the local favorites. The problem was, most of these people never actually performed, as the weather really did kill this concert. Nice to know they got good reviews, though. On the other hand, Udu Mango played a strong set that weekend prior to the really bad weather setting in, and we successfully managed to escape any attention at all from the local news media. Because this was originally a big deal for us, we enlisted the help of some extra musician friends and rehearsed for the festival as an 8-piece version of the band. That became a little bit like herding cats, but overall it was a ton of fun. For the rhythm section, we had Yvonne on an electronic drum kit, another drummer named Dave on an acoustic kit, plus our friend Jim with all his percussion instruments. Mike played piano, another Dave played bass, and our dear and talented friend Deborah Lee helped me out with the vocals. Sven, the Swedish blues singer, sat in on a harmonica, and that turned into some great jams with Sven, Mike, and I trading licks back and forth. During one of those jams, Jim Coltman played a percussion solo for the ages, and amazingly, the whole thing got recorded. At one point during our set, there were several tie-dye wearing dancers singing along in the front row, and later on, when the rain really started coming down, we had to stop briefly and move the piano out of harm's way, further back under cover. The next morning, my Les Paul looked like it had barely survived some kind of war. It was absolutely filthy with layers and layers of grime from all the rain the night before. Even with the horrible weather, the onstage sound for our set at this festival was the best I'd ever experienced. When sound is properly dialed in, the music plays itself. At least that's the best way I can describe it. A great mix brings everyone together, and that was certainly the case during our Woodstock performance. When the set ended, I immediately sought out the sound tech who had made it so amazing for us, and was soon shaking hands with Orest. While I was thanking him profusely, his big smile turned very serious, and he said to me, "Tom Cochrane has hugged me for my mixes." Now I've taken your time, I have sung you my song. Ain't no great revelation, but it wasn't too long. But that's all right, people. I figure the odds be 50-50. I just might have something to say. Frank Zappa. Epilogue, Fall, 2024. The more things change, the more they stay the same. My friend Tim sings the outlaw country music of Waylon Jennings and Willie Nelson, and is quite popular with the local audience who enjoy that genre. He often hires me to play lead guitar at these gigs, and for a few weeks now we've been booked and advertised as appearing tonight at a local brew pub. Tim had invited lots of friends to the gig, and he and I spent some quality time the other day rehearsing the material, all in service of doing our best work for this business, which of course included promoting their venue on our own social media. Yesterday afternoon, I received a text message saying that we were being canceled due to a double booking at the venue. I call bullshit, of course. This is now the second time this venue has done this. We were booked weeks in advance, included in their advertising, and then suddenly canceled with barely 24 hours' notice. Someone must be collecting a favor somewhere at our expense, and I don't mind telling you. Insert rant here. Good news, though. Because of my newfound sunny disposition, this kind of hiccup is just no big deal anymore. Freaking out not required. The way I see it is, Tim and I had fun the other day hanging out and singing some songs, and then I ended up with a free evening at the last minute, which gave me time to write this epilogue. I'm calling it a win.